I have always admired good street photographers because what they show us is something real. It's a glimpse into people's life, not just what people chose to show you on their social media. Street photography is perhaps the easiest genre of photography to pick up, but it's one of the hardest to get really good at. Because on top of everything, you're often dealing with people who are not necessarily willing participants in your hobby. I'm on a mission to improve my skills in street photography. So in this video, I'm gonna tell you where I am, how I got to where I am, and what I'm going to do to improve myself. I divided that into a few steps, and in this video, and the subject of this video is how am I going to improve my photos with using lights and shadows in my street photography. The very first thing I did in photography was street. The thing was, I always found Iceland, being from Iceland, I always found Iceland extremely boring for street photography. I just didn't see anything to shoot. Everything looked the same. The people, they all looked the same. Everybody had the same dark clothes on. The architecture was kind of gray and unimpressive. It was just normal, and normal was boring. So I did exactly the same as I see other bad street photographers do. I tried to look for something different in unfortunate people because they stuck out. They were different. Big events like the protest that followed the crisis in 2008 gave me an opportunity to shoot protests and riots, something I found fun and exciting. But apart from bombs and big events, well, Iceland street photography was just boring for me. So for years, I mostly did landscape. I love shooting landscape. How can you not love shooting landscape? But and landscape, it is somewhat easier to get proficient or even good in landscape photography than in street photography. And I didn't really go back to street until I started doing my travel photography tours and travel photography. Then I kind of rediscovered my spark and my love for photography. Not to say that I was getting bored with landscape, it was just something new, something exciting, something I felt like I was getting the hang of. I was shooting a lot, mostly happy with my work, and I came to the conclusion that really I just needed to travel to make interesting street photography because home is normal. Home is too normal to be interesting, which I later found out it's completely false. I mean, just think about it. Street photography is all about telling stories. And who better to tell a story than someone who tells his own story from his reality, story from his life. Outsiders, they do see things differently. Often they see the same thing kind of excites them, and therefore travel photos are often very similar with little depth, little understanding on people's life. You have to know something about the people or the places you are shooting. You have to have some input in order to get some meaningful output. You have to know something to be able to tell a story. Take for example Fan Ho. Chinese photographer, Hong Kong-based photographer. He passed away recently, 2016, if I'm correct. One of the best in my opinion, one of the best street photographers ever lived. He only shot his home, but he did it with such depth and understanding. you can really see his connections to the people, to the places he's shooting in his photo. Do you think his body of work would be equally impressive if he would only have shot his street photography on short trips to, let's say, Europe? I don't think so, but this is an oversimplification. There are many other factors that comes into consideration when you in street photography than only that. So what am I doing? What are the steps I'm taking to improve myself? Well, firstly, I need to identify what it is I like. What in other people's street photography do I like? And to know that, I just study other photographers, other street photographers like Van Ho, which we just saw, and Sebastian Salgado, that's an amazing photographer, Steve McCurry. I mean, these are huge names in photography. They are masters of photography, and it is for a reason. They are very, very good. But there are also younger guys like Sean Tucker and Alan Schaller. I think they're both London-based photographer, amazing storytellers. And it is something about how they use light and shadows in their photographs that I want to study closer. So that is my first business. That's my first step, to practice that, using light and shadows in my street photos. So I went out 2 times with my wife and 2 daughters because I wanted to use them as subject. I wanted to focus on the task at hand, not to deal with unwilling participants. So what I did is I walked around, I looked for composition, and normally when I have my composition, I set up and I wait for somebody to walk in my frame. But in this case, it was pretty easy because I had my subjects with me. I only had to tell them cross this street or walk by. I didn't really pose them, I just told them where to go. But I do pose sometimes. I find I have no issues with posing someone. I decided to shoot black and white because I was focusing on light and shadows, and shooting black and white requires me to think more about my compositions. I find black and white, to make a great composition in black and white, is more difficult. Probably because I don't do a lot of it, and I think there's some ground in it. It is more difficult. There are more things to consider. Settings are much less important than many people think. What you shoot is what makes your photo, not the settings you use. And I find it extremely strange when people tell you the right settings for street photography. You know, this is the right settings for street photography, or any photography for that matter. It depends on what you want, what you're trying to do. There are no right settings. But for this practice, I had 2 methods. First, when I was walking around looking for a composition, I wanted to be ready for anything. If something came up, I wanted to be able to shoot it fast. So I set my aperture and speed to a fixed setting, and I choose ISO, and I set ISO to auto. This will correctly expose my photos by increasing or decreasing the ISO, not touching the aperture and speed. With this, I won't have blurry images due to camera shake because speed is fast enough around, I think I had it around 1/250th or 1/500th to freeze most movement on the street. I had the required depth of field. I like shallow depth of field in street, so in this case I was mostly at f1.4. This could mean that because of a high ISO, I get some grain in my photos, but I don't mind grain. I just don't care. I want the photo, I want the mood, I want the atmosphere, I want the story. It's not about having grain or not. And second, when I did find my composition, I set everything to manual because I don't want the camera trying to balance out my exposure when I'm focusing on light and shadow. I just set my camera to get the desired look. I usually try to protect my highlights, which means I can get really dark shadows in a high contrast scene, and that is in this case what I want. Yes, you could also use exposure compensations, but I personally find it easier to just use manual in these cases. Unlike in landscape, I'm not that concerned about if I occasionally blow out my highlights or clip my shadow. I try not to. But I don't do I don't do bracketing or anything like that in street. I just live with my camera limitations, and it's more about getting the story than having a technically perfect photo. Even if it's a little blurry, I don't mind it if the photo is good. This is by no means the only right settings for street photography, as I mentioned earlier. This is the setting I used this time to get these results. I have the tendency to bring way too much stuff when I go out and shoot. It's carrying a lot of stuff. It really limits my mobility, and it just really takes away the joy from street photography. Also, what I notice in my photos, I tend to zoom in too much. So I'm not shooting wide enough. So in this case, I limited myself to only one lens. 35mm prime, that's it. I don't have to carry anything, just one camera, one lens, and I didn't have the option to zoom in, so I had to use other methods. But even if those 2 nights were to practice using light and shadows, don't forget to capture the moment when you see it. Don't just ignore stuff because you're on assignment. Be vigilant of the environment around you. So these were my practice shots. I knew what I wanted, and I basically knew how to get it, but there is a huge room for improvement. And the only way to improve is to go out and shoot, because that's the only way to train the eyes, to train your eyes to see things, and your reflexes, and of course, people skills, which is very important in street photography. So soon I will do another video where I'll be focusing on another part of street photography, learning more, trying to understand more, get some depth in my photography, my street photography. And if you want to tag along, if you want to go with me on this journey, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell if you haven't done that already, so you don't miss a beat. Having said that, thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed this. Let's go out and practice some more.